In the ancient world, gods and kings fought the forces of chaos. These are their stories.
Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Today we're going to look at how the Israelites understood the concepts of chaos and order. Now, chaos and order are familiar ideas to us, but those words don't really show up frequently in the Bible. So why are we looking at chaos and order in the Bible if they don't really show up there? Are these concepts present even though those words aren't used? Well, for the ancient Israelites and for other ancient Near Eastern peoples, the concepts of chaos and order had everything to do with the way the universe was structured. Now, what was cosmic order and how was it achieved? What was cosmic disorder like and how did you identify it? Using the ideas of the sea myth will help us in exploring these ideas, and we'll see that not only are these ideas present, but more prevalent than most people might imagine.
The sea myth is a meta-narrative within ancient Near Eastern myths where the state of the world moves from pre-order or disorder into conflict and then order. This is often done with a god coming into combat with a water god, and as a consequence of this ordering, the victorious god orders the world in some sort of creative action, and they are awarded the kingship of the gods as well as a palace to reside in. Today, we're going to focus on the ideas of order and disorder in the Hebrew Bible, and particularly how they pertain to kingship. Now, the concepts of chaos and order are experiencing a bit of a renaissance in our culture, so looking at these ideas in the Bible should be instructive. Now, as we tend to do here at Beneath the Bible, we're going to look at the broader world of the Bible before we look at the Bible itself. Now, this is helpful because we'll see that other cultures had their own ideas and vocabulary around these ideas of chaos and order. And when we find some commonality across cultures, we can reasonably expect the Israelites to also have their own vocabulary and shades of meaning around these commonly held ideas. The most obvious place to start is in Egypt because they had a goddess who was associated with the proper functioning and ordering of the world named Ma'at. Now, in Egyptian mythology, Ma'at was both the daughter of the sun god as well as the idea of cosmic harmony. She represented justice, truth, and moral integrity. And in Egyptian political philosophy, the pharaohs saw Ma'at as the source of their authority to rule. The pharaohs were tasked with preserving Ma'at and bringing Ma'at back after a time of turmoil. The opposing idea to Ma'at was called Isfet. And when Ma'at was not in the land, Isfet was. A 12th dynasty text called the Prophecy of Nefertiti describes what it was like when Isfet is present and Ma'at is absent. It says, "The river of Egypt is dry. One can cross the water on foot. One seeks water for ships to sail on it, its course having become a riverbank." And it continues, "All happiness has gone away. The land is cast down in trouble because of those feeders, Asiatics who are throughout the land. Enemies have arisen in the east. Asiatics have come down to Egypt." But it prophesies that a king will come who will take the crowns of Egypt, and then order, or Ma'at, will come to its right place, and chaos, or Isfet, will be driven out. We can see that in Egypt, the kings ruled by Ma'at, or justice and truth, and the just or unjust rule of the kings had cosmic implications. When they ruled rightly and there was Ma'at, the river flooded at its appointed time, and the sun and moon rose and set as expected. The cosmos functioned rightly. Now, when the kings did not rule justly, Ma'at was absent and Isfet reigned, throwing the orderliness of both the natural and supernatural worlds out of balance. In Mesopotamia, they had similar ideas. In Mesopotamia, there was a hendiadys that encapsulated their sense of justice and premise for right ruling. This hendiadys was the Akkadian phrase kittum u misharum. Kittum derives from the word for stable or stability, and here it means something like everyone getting what was owed them. And misharum derives from the word for straightness, and here it means something like setting right difficult situations or something like that. Together, these words communicate a sense of justice, particularly social justice. The scholar Richard Smith says this phrase can refer to a sense or disposition for just ruling which is granted to the king by God. Hammurabi stated, "I established kittum and misharum throughout the land. I dealt kindly with the people." And he set up his famous law code as proof of his just rulings. Throughout Mesopotamian literature, the kings who established kittum and misharum are understood to be good. Nebuchadnezzar II portrayed himself as walking the way of kittum and misharum. Ways of doing this included making and enforcing just laws, providing for the poor and downtrodden, and in royal ideology, the formal establishment of misharum went alongside andurarum, or freedom. This was freeing the enslaved and returning property to its owner. Ultimately, kittum and misharum were gifts bestowed by the gods. An inscription from the site of Mari from one king named Yadunlim says Shamash, the god of justice, gives kittum and misharum as his gifts to the king. And Ashurbanipal claimed to have been given kittum and misharum from the gods, and I could go on, but the point is, in Mesopotamia, as in Egypt, the king's role was to rule by rightly established justice, which was a gift from the gods.
Now, because they had a distinct culture from the people around them, the Israelites didn't use either ma'at or kittum misharum in the Bible to express their ideas of order. So, what did the Israelites use? Well, like the Mesopotamians, the Israelites used a hendiadys, or to express their concept of cosmic order. In this case, mishpat v'tzedakah, or justice and righteousness. As with kittum and misharum, both mishpat and tzedakah have their own independent meanings, but when used together, they connote a sense of cosmic order or harmony. The sense of cosmic order in this phrase was noted by the German scholar H.H. Schmidt, and we'll put the citation in the description below if you want to check it out. Now, the Israelite idea of cosmic order is that when the world is functioning as it ought to, it's the way God ordered it. As with Egypt and Mesopotamia, it was the job of the king to enact and establish this right order. We see this most clearly in the royal psalm, Psalm 72. Now, this psalm may have been used during the coronation or during an annual celebration of the enthronement of the king. The first two verses set the tone, stating, "Endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness. May he judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice." These verses reinforce the idea that it's the job of the king to rule with justice and righteousness, to bring God's order among God's people. We also see this in 2 Samuel 8:15. Richard Smith argues that this verse begins a narrative unit within 2 Samuel that goes from this verse all the way to 2 Samuel 20, almost 12 full chapters. Now, this narrative unit follows the idea of David establishing justice and righteousness, or many times failing to do so. Well, the point for our purposes is that this idea of right order is a structuring principle for Israelite kingship, one that dominates the telling of the story of David, who was in many ways the paramount king of Israel to which all others are compared. But the Israelites had more vocabulary than justice and righteousness to describe order and disorder. Now, you may be familiar with the word shalom. It's usually translated as peace, and that's correct. But shalom is more than that. It's a marker of right order. When there is justice and righteousness, then there will be shalom. Isaiah 32 verses 16 and 17 say as much. Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness will remain in the fertile field. And the work of righteousness will be peace, and the service of righteousness, quietness and confidence forever. Isaiah 11, one of my favorite Bible passages, describes the lion laying down with the lamb, an image of perfect shalom. Now, in this case, the right ordering of the world even makes these adversaries peaceably coexist. Now, back in Psalm 72, we get a picture of shalom, when the king is ruling with justice and righteousness. We can see that shalom was mediated by the king. There were also times, however, when there was no shalom. Habakkuk 3 is a good example of this. The land is suffering because there is no shalom. And when shalom is gone, the land becomes unproductive, and the land, and therefore the people, suffer. Things were not always ordered in the world of the Israelites. There were times when good order, either natural or societal, were disrupted. For example, the word akar is often translated to trouble, and it's often understood to connote the transgression of a taboo, for example, breaking the harem or ban. Akar also seems to carry cosmic significance at times. Robert Murray highlights this usage in 1 Kings 17 and 18. In 1 Kings 17, Elijah goes before Ahab and uses a familiar curse formula and commands Yahweh, the God of Israel, in whose presence I stand, to stop rain and dew until Elijah says otherwise. In the following chapter, Ahab calls to Elijah and says, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Now, this is Ahab leveling an accusation against Elijah of bringing cosmic disorder on the land by causing the rain to be withheld. The land is suffering, a marker of a lack of shalom. Elijah responds by saying, "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." Elijah turns the tables on Ahab. He says it's Ahab who has brought disorder on the land because he has pursued Baal and not Yahweh, the true bringer of order who bestows Shalom. Now this exchange is followed by Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal, where the power of the various gods is put to the test. We also see this use of the word Akar in Joshua 7 with the story of Achan. There is a bit of a play on words with the story of Achan in Joshua. He takes loot from Jericho in violation of the harem, or taboo, and so he brings trouble on his family. Achan brings Akar by violating the rules established by God. Now, there's also a curious story in 1 Samuel 14 where King Saul makes a rash vow that his son Jonathan unintentionally violates. In response, Jonathan says of his father, "My father has made trouble for the country." Now, don't miss how significant this accusation is. The anointed king, the supposed bringer of justice and righteousness, has actually brought trouble or disorder on the land. Other words that are associated with disorder are also associated with water. Now, not all water imagery in the Bible is referring to chaotic waters or forces opposing the order of Yahweh, but in many cases the waters are used to refer to disorder. For example, the word tehom is usually translated the deep, as in Genesis 1:2. Now, it's not always clear, however, if this is just deep water or if it's the deep, as in a named force with agency that opposes the work of Yahweh. Tehom has been linked etymologically with Tiamat, the antagonist of Marduk in the Enuma Elish, but it isn't clear if Tehom is supposed to be animated in the same way as Tiamat. Now, we certainly see creatures like Leviathan, Rahab, and the generic Tanim, or dragons, as chaotic forces opposing God's work. There are obvious connections to the sea myth here, but again, sometimes it's simply water or the waters that can be forces of disorder with no supernatural element. We'll look at more of these connections later this year, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Now that we've spent some time looking at the sea myth outside of Israel, and also how Israel understood it in light of order and disorder, let's take a look again at Genesis 1. This passage is almost unintelligible without the lens of the sea myth. Now, we don't see combat in Genesis 1, but the story is setting it up for us. We're supposed to expect it, but it isn't there. Now, this is an important and symbolically significant alteration of the sea myth paradigm. Instead of conflict, the sovereignty of God, the kingship of God, is paramount. Now, for example, the sea creatures are told in verses 20 to 22 to be fruitful and multiply. Now, the original audience would have immediately associated these sea creatures with mythical beasts opposing divine order, but they pose no threat to God, so they are allowed to multiply. It's also notable that on day 6, when God makes man, he makes man in God's image. Now, while the image of God means many things, and we won't settle it here and now, without a doubt there is an element of it that has to do with kingship. In the ancient Near East, kings were said to bear the image of the gods. Only on rare occasions were anyone other than kings described as having the image of the gods. And we also see in the ancient world that images of gods and kings existed as substitutes via representation. The images were thought to somehow contain at least something of the essence of the deity or king, and they manifest their presence. But here the Bible expands this quality to all of humanity. We all now are like kings in that we all bear the image of God. We are given the image of God, and with it, God's role as king over creation is given to all of us, according to Genesis 1, 29 to 30, as well as several verses in Genesis 2. With this image bearing comes all the responsibilities of overcoming chaos and bringing right order. And after God orders the world in the first 6 days, on the 7th day, God rests. Now, the gods were always understood to rest in a palace or temple, but there's no explicit temple in Genesis 1, only the world that God has created. God is not filling a palace he made for himself the way Baal did. The whole cosmos is his palace. It follows then that there is no room for any other temple or divine palace in this cosmos. Now, rather than rest as the cessation of activity, we can understand God's rest in his palace as essentially the work of creatio continua. God is sustaining creation, a no less creative project than the creatio prima on days 1 through 6. Genesis 1 assumes that the reader knows the various iterations of the sea myth. The original audience would have been familiar with it, and if you aren't familiar with it as a modern reader, you're missing some of what's going on. Now, this isn't just true for Genesis 1. We find this imagery all over the New Testament. For example, Psalm 89 links these ideas of justice and righteousness with the sea myth. In verses 9 through 18, we see a brief recounting of the sea myth. This section is in the past tense and recounts God's victory over the chaotic waters in the past to express confidence in Yahweh's capability to deliver Israel in the future. Now, this section begins with Yahweh ruling over the chaotic waters, stating that he has crushed the chaotic sea monster Rahab. It then moves to celebrate the sovereignty of God over heaven and earth, and the world celebrates his victory. Justice and righteousness are the foundation of God's throne, presumably in his palace. The psalm goes on to affirm God's commitment to the house of David. So in this passage, we see that in the aftermath of the disordered world, Rahab and the sea are defeated. As a result, Yahweh is established on his throne as king, ruling on a foundation of justice and righteousness, or right order. Finally, we see kingship, specifically God's commitment to the line of David, as the theme of the rest of the psalm. Here, these defining themes of Israelite literature, order and disorder, justice and righteousness, and the creative adaptation of ancient Near Eastern myths, all converge in one place. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. Be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any future videos. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.